presentation. I think my presentation links very well with what Daniele was just presenting about the challenges and how to actually implement the approach when it comes to climate justice. Because talking about climate justice is one part, but when it comes to implementation, particularly talking about just transition, it's not that straightforward. And we need international cooperation to make that happen. And this is where the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty comes into picture. It's a bold project. It's about phasing out fossil fuels and supporting a global just transition. And I'm going to share a few details on how we look at the context that we are living in and why we need a treaty to enable just transition and phasing out of fossil fuels, especially in the current context. I'm sure you must be aware how the World Economic Forum 2019-2020 report identified climate action failure, which in fact we are seeing, unfortunately, and extreme weather events. Look at what's happening in Europe right now in terms of heat waves and wildfires, and we have seen such heat waves around the world. And I'm from India, living in Delhi, so I can tell you we have seen some of the worst extreme weather events, and these are the biggest global threat. And now look at 3 years later how these threats have become real. And if you look at on your left, there's weapons of mass destruction, which in terms of impact may be as severe, but in terms of likelihood, climate action failure and extreme weather events have the most likelihood, and that's exactly what we are seeing right now. So all the fears that we had about global threats have become absolutely real. And we all know that fossil fuels are very much behind the crisis that we are facing. More than 80% of energy continues to come from fossil fuels, and we have yet not been able to tackle the supply side of the crisis. And if we continue to produce the way we are, and which is about doubling the production that is consistent with 1.5 degrees Celsius. So which means that we really need to stop expansion and phase out fossil fuels. And the existing projects around coal, oil, and gas are going to blow up the chance of staying below 1.5 degree limit that we have set as the global community. We all celebrate how we have seen increase in renewables, but if you look at this particular graph, we realize that renewables are actually feeding the increased demand of energy and not really shaking the overall proportion in terms of dependence on fossil fuel. So in 2009, we were dependent on fossil fuel for about 80.3%, and it's now only 80.2%. So all the efforts that we have made in terms of renewables are only responding to the increased demand and not really looking at the problem of the supply side of fossil fuels. And this is where we see that if there is no global agreement on fossil fuel production side, it's going to make the transition extremely hard. And we are going to see stranded assets. And again, if I link it with the current reality, there are going to be more for fossil fuel production in the wake of war in Ukraine to match the supply and demand that is there. But the new investments that we are making, particularly in Africa, are going to leave stranded assets and are going to risk financial turmoil in that region in the next few years. And then we will see that we will create risks to workers and communities who are now going to be involved in these projects for the next few years, and then they will not have any other opportunity to look to. And it's also now going to delay renewable energy expansion. While there is a talk about increasing renewable energy as well, but the risk is much more that we are going to have more investments in fossil fuel sector, particularly oil and gas. Another aspect that is required by countries to make just transition is economic diversification. But if we do not focus on fossil fuel phase out, we will not explore new economic avenues and diversify our economy, particularly for countries who are massively dependent on fossil fuel for their economic activities and revenues. And we're also seeing that, again, in the last few months, we have seen the fossil fuel political constituencies and the corporations have become much more stronger, which means that we will see increased risk of technical, economic, legal, and political lock-in. And when we talk about climate emergency, the natural response now coming from the people who or corporations who don't want to limit their emissions is to propose geoengineering, which we know can be extremely dangerous because it's an unproven technology and it's going to make vulnerable countries and communities more vulnerable to newer risks. And if we do not phase out fossil fuels, we are risk warming well above 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. Now, in the last few months, we have seen repeated calls from International Energy Agency, which so far has been quite conservative, is now very clear that we don't need any further investments in new fossil fuel supply if we really want to be consistent with our net zero pathways and plans. We've seen how UN Secretary General has been attacking the fossil fuel industry and saying that if we continue to depend on fossil fuels, it's going to be a death knell. And how several reports that are coming from IPCC are saying that if we continue to depend on fossil fuel, it's going to destroy our planet. Paris Agreement does not mention fossil fuels. Only at COP26 in the Glasgow Climate Pact, there's a weak mention of unabated coal power without mention of oil and gas, which we know that the investments are increasing. And we need a complementary mechanism to manage fossil fuel production globally, which absolutely does not exist. At COP26 again in Glasgow, there was a discussion about supporting South Africa to phase out from fossil fuels, and there was a figure of $8.5 billion being quoted, but we have not seen that money. We have not seen any framework how South Africa is going to be supported. Now, again, linking with the previous presentation from Daniele, why it is difficult. There was an example of Ecuador. Let's look at this particular chart a little more closely. On the y-axis, it's about capacity to fund just transition. And on the x-axis, you see how governments are dependent on oil share of revenues. And when you look at countries like Azerbaijan or Timor-Leste or Congo, whose economies depend on oil for more than 50% of revenues, and if you look at their per capita income, which is on y-axis, you find that they're poor compared to countries like UK, Canada, and the US, who have high per capita income, but their revenue from oil is very little. Yet they continue to expand their investments in fossil fuel industry. So imagine we are doing the campaigning saying we all should become net zero by 2050, but if in the absence of any international cooperation and the framework, how countries like Angola, Nigeria, Algeria, Iran, Iraq, Congo are going to make that transition if there is no support available? And all countries are at various levels in terms of their dependence on revenues. And this is where Fossil Fuel Treaty, which has been drawn from the nuclear disarmament system, where we talk about non-proliferation. And in this case, proliferation means no new exploration and expansion. We talk about global disarmament, which means phasing out of fossil fuels, and a just transition, which is about a peaceful transition as we speak in terms of nuclear. And this is where we are working on these pillars, where we are talking about no new exploration and phasing out equitably, and the need for just transition. What we do in terms of our objectives, we are demanding global norms, and we need to change those global norms by demonstrating widespread action on fossil fuel supply side. As I mentioned earlier, we need to provide a missing framework and mechanism for a multilateral agreement for a just transition. And we need to grow the global movement by ensuring equity, demands, and analysis at the very core of this new global framework. And what we are doing right now, we are motivating cities and states to endorse the treaty. I'm very pleased to share just yesterday, the Vatican endorsed the treaty, and we now have about 60 cities and governments who have endorsed the treaty, which actually creates a political momentum to push now countries to adopt the treaty, and we have seen that kind of groundswell happening in the last 2 years. We would also like to increase transparency and accountability by developing research and creating systems like Global Registry on fossil fuels. And we are complementing frontline and finance campaigns with a unifying political demand. So we know that we are not the first ones to talk about fossil fuel phase out. We would like to support those existing campaigns to make sure that we are working in conjunction. I would also like to say a little bit on just transition before I talk about what we have done so far. Our perspective of just transition, because that's what the conversation is about, we understand that fossil fuel phase out will affect all aspects of the modern life that we have. And this important recognition means that we are talking about economy-wide and system-wide changes. And depending on how we manage the transition, if we do not take the justice into account, we will actually create more injustice that what people are facing right now. And we also need to recognize that richer countries have more responsibility because, again, my previous presenter, Daniele, was talking about how poverty exists more in the developing world and how rich countries have more resources. And we must put human rights at the center, particularly workers' rights. And workers and unions are the leaders of social change. And they will also need training support and new working and opportunities. We also need to talk about their engagement in the process alongside indigenous people, youth, and fossil fuel affected communities to ensure that transition is just. And we also need to organize these communities to secure demands, and particularly the demand for social protection. And we also understand that there is no one path for just transition. That's how we call it just transitions in many ways, because we need to also talk about workers in the agriculture sector, in the tourism sector. So what we need is a set of principles. And I'm also pleased to share that we've started some work on principles, and we will be sharing and reaching out to you to give inputs on how we develop those principles so that countries and communities are able to make that just transition with adequate support. So far, we have a team of 40 people in 15 countries, and we have been working closely with officials in about 40 countries. We have 1,500 organizations supporting. We have partnership with 12 organizations. We have convened high-level meetings, and we have done message testing in terms of how we further expand the campaign with millions of people. So this is a team of people who are there from various parts of the world. So from young people to activists from various parts of the world, the legal brains who are supporting and well-known activists. And civil society organizations who are supporting it, they're spread around the world. In terms of theory of change, I've broadly talked about it. So we do talk about establishing enabling conditions for a global movement. So we being a network, we work very closely with faith community, with peace and security, youth and indigenous people and women's groups, labor. We want to shift the narrative. We want to enhance accountability and transparency. We are demanding a global just transition. And as I've been saying, you can see that we are creating pressure from below, particularly from cities and subnational governments. And we have been quite successful so far. So big cities like London, Paris, Bonn, they all have endorsed the treaty. And we want to build the evidence base, so we are also involved in the research side. And we are working very closely with other frontline financial and other campaigns to complement their theory of change. In terms of diplomatic engagement, we are working with a club of countries. We feel that if we have a couple of countries coming together based on the pressure that we are creating, we will be able to get that political momentum. We also want to create a global registry, which we are going to launch September this year around the UN Climate Week. We are also working with our allies on the Global Commission on Fossil Fuels so that we have a global system before we reach a point where we get the treaty, which will have all these three pillars that I talked about: new exploration, ending new exploration and production, phasing out fossil fuels equitably, and managing a just transition. These are our partners. There are many more in different parts of the world. I already talked about. I must also share that we have more than 300 nationally elected parliamentarians, officials. We have got 100 Nobel laureates who supported it. And as I said, we have 60 plus cities. And our demands have been covered by media all around the world. So yeah, this is Dalai Lama plus 100 Nobel laureates. And we have voices from around the world: Sydney, Vancouver, Montreal. Ottawa recently endorsed the treaty as well. We have youth activists who made a call for treaty. We have academics, Michael Iman from the academic side supporting the treaty. So these are the elected officials who are calling for a fossil fuel-free future. We were engaged massively in the Stockholm Plus 50 process, and we do feel that through our engagement and pressure, this is the first time UN conference clearly recommended phase out of fossil fuels, which has not happened previously in many UN agreements that we have seen. And we're also doing research work. I know I'm out of time, so I'm just running quickly. I'll be around to answer any questions. This is our campaign hub. So you can go to the website, campaign.fossilfueltreaty.org, and you can engage by endorsing. As an organization, you can promote the concept. You can call on cities, and you can also work with various constituencies like youth, faith, academics, parliamentarians, and so on. I'll stop here.